I want to talk about a story that barely made a ripple compared to how big it probably should have been. And I think the reason it stayed so quiet actually tells you something important about how companies, especially beloved ones, manage bad news. Nintendo, a company that basically nobody has anything bad to say about, a company that's built an entire brand around nostalgia, family-friendly fun, and a level of public goodwill that most corporations would kill for, quietly disclosed that employee data had been stolen in a breach. And I want to be upfront here, the public details on this one are genuinely thin. This isn't a story with a dramatic countdown clock from an extortion group, or a viral leak site post with a Nintendo logo slapped on it for internet points. It's a quieter kind of story, the kind that shows up in a threat intelligence roundup, gets mentioned once, and then just sort of fades into the background noise of an industry that's dealing with breach news practically every single week now. But I think that quietness is actually the most interesting part of this whole thing, and I want to unpack why. Think about how differently the internet reacts to a Nintendo story versus almost any other company's story. If literally any other tech company has a bad week, it becomes a meme within hours. People are roasting them on social media, making jokes, dragging their name through every possible angle for content. But Nintendo has this bizarre kind of Teflon reputation, where even genuinely concerning news tends to just slide right off, because the emotional relationship people have with this brand is so deeply rooted in childhood nostalgia that it's almost immune to normal corporate criticism. I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it's actually a broader pattern that applies way beyond just Nintendo. The companies with the strongest emotional brand loyalty are often the ones that get the least scrutiny when something goes wrong, purely because their audience doesn't want to believe anything bad about them. Nobody wants to be the person ruining the vibe by pointing out that the company behind their childhood memories just had employee data stolen. It feels almost rude, even though it's just reporting a fact. But here's why I think this actually matters more than people give it credit for. Employee data breaches don't get the same viral attention as customer data breaches, because the general public doesn't feel personally at risk. If it's not your data, your card number, your login, it's easy to scroll past it as someone else's problem. But employee breaches are genuinely serious in their own right. Honestly, sometimes more serious than customer breaches, because of what employee data typically includes. We're talking about things like social security numbers, home addresses, banking details for payroll, sometimes even background check information. This is exactly the kind of data that makes someone a target for identity theft. And unlike a stolen credit card, you can't just cancel a social security number and get a new one. So when a company like Nintendo has employee data stolen, even if it barely makes headlines, there are real people, actual employees, who probably love their jobs at a company they likely grew up admiring, now dealing with the anxiety of wondering if their personal information is floating around somewhere they can't control. That's a real human cost that doesn't disappear just because the story didn't trend on social media. I also think there's something worth talking about regarding how differently gaming and entertainment companies seem to handle disclosure compared to, say, financial institutions or healthcare providers. There's often less public pressure, less regulatory spotlight, at least in terms of public perception, even though the actual legal disclosure requirements might be similar. A healthcare breach involving social security numbers becomes national news. A gaming company breach involving very similar types of data barely gets a paragraph in a niche cybersecurity newsletter. I don't think that's necessarily because gaming companies are being intentionally sneaky about it. I think it's more that the media ecosystem covering these industries is just fundamentally different. Cybersecurity journalists who cover healthcare breaches are often deeply embedded in health policy and regulatory reporting, where there's an entire infrastructure built around holding companies accountable. Gaming industry coverage tends to be more focused on new releases, console news, and fandom culture, and security incidents just don't fit neatly into that beat the same way. Which honestly means these stories can slip through with way less accountability pressure than they probably deserve, not because anyone's covering anything up, but simply because the audience and the reporting infrastructure aren't built to dig into it the same way. I think this actually connects to something bigger that's worth thinking about if you work anywhere, at any company, regardless of industry. The size of the public reaction to a breach has almost nothing to do with the actual severity of the breach itself. A relatively contained, quietly handled incident at a beloved brand can generate zero outrage, while a smaller, less severe incident at a less popular company can blow up into a massive news cycle purely based on public sentiment and existing narrative around that brand. Which means if you're evaluating how seriously to take news about a company's security practices, the volume of public reaction is honestly a terrible way to judge it. You have to actually look at what happened, what type of data was involved, and how the company responded, rather than just gauging it by how loud the internet got about it. I also want to gently push back on the instinct some people might have here, which is assuming that because this story stayed quiet, it must not have been that serious. We genuinely don't have enough public detail to make that call either way. What we do know is that this is happening within a broader wave of employee and third-party data breaches hitting companies across nearly every industry this year, from manufacturing to entertainment to accounting. Nintendo isn't some unique outlier here. It's one data point in a pattern that's showing up basically everywhere right now, at companies with reputations ranging from beloved to barely known. I think the honest takeaway here isn't really about Nintendo specifically being good or bad at security. It's about recognizing that our collective attention to these stories is wildly inconsistent, shaped far more by brand affection than by actual severity. A company we love gets a quiet pass. A company we don't have strong feelings about gets dragged. And a company we already dislike for unrelated reasons gets absolutely torched in the comments, regardless of how the actual breach compares in scale or seriousness to the others. If there's a lesson in here for any of you building or working at companies right now, it's this. Don't assume public reaction is a reliable signal of how seriously you should be taking a security incident, whether it's your own company or one you're just reading about. The quiet ones deserve just as much scrutiny as the loud ones, sometimes more, because quiet often just means the audience wasn't emotionally primed to be outraged, not that the actual damage was smaller. Employee data matters. Vendor data matters. Every piece of information a company holds about the people connected to it, whether that's customers or staff, deserves the same level of seriousness, regardless of whether the internet decides to make it a moment or just let it quietly scroll by in a threat report nobody outside the industry ever reads. Nintendo will be fine, reputation-wise. The brand is simply too beloved, too nostalgic, too deeply woven into people's childhoods for a quiet employee data story to meaningfully dent it. But the employees whose information was actually part of that breach don't get the same protection that brand loyalty gives the company. They're just dealing with the real consequences, quietly, the same way the story itself stayed quiet. If this changed how you think about which breach stories actually deserve your attention, subscribe, because we're going to keep digging into the ones that don't get the spotlight they probably should.